So here's a funny little story about the reduce helper. When I was writing the section about reduce, I did a Google search of my own to find some very practical examples of reduce in action. So I personally have used reduce many times to great effect on applications I work on, but they tend to always require some domain-specific knowledge, and so it wasn't really appropriate to bring those examples for this tutorial. So anyways, I was doing some Googling, trying to figure out what is a standalone good example of reduce. And I found many threads, like on Stack Overflow and resources like that, of people who were kind of asking the same question. And the very ironic thing was that every single example out there of someone saying, hey, what's a practical use of reduce? Everyone says, oh, you use it to sum numbers. That's what everyone is obsessed with the purpose of reduce. They are always thinking, we use reduce to sum numbers. And you know what? That's not exactly true. We can use reduce for many different things. So in this section, I want to give you maybe not a super practical example, something you'll be doing on a day-to-day basis. Instead, we're going to do something a little bit more interesting here. So if you've ever done a job interview for a tech job, you might have had to do a whiteboard coding exercise, right? It's like where they stand you up at the whiteboard, you get asked a question, and then you have to solve it on the fly on the whiteboard. So a very common whiteboarding question, and this is like one of the most common ones that I've ever seen, has been what we refer to as the balanced parens or parentheses problem. So the question is generally something like, you are given a string of characters, like say something like this, and you have to write a function that decides whether or not the parentheses in this expression are balanced. So in this expression right here, it doesn't have to be valid JavaScript. We're just talking about, are these parentheses balanced? So in this case, I would have balanced parentheses because we've got open and close, open and close, open and close, open and close. I could have something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And this would also be balanced because for every opening one, I've got a closing one as well. If I start doing something like that or something like this, those are both unbalanced expressions because I don't have a closing paren for every opening one. And then the other kind of edge case we have to worry about is something like this, where we have an opening and closing, but they're on the opposite sides of where they should be. So something like this would also be unbalanced as well. So the common coding question here is, given a string that contains some number of parentheses, are the expressions correctly balanced? So this would be a fantastic use of the reduce helper. So let's figure out how to do it. Before we start this solution, I want to tell you that if you figure out or kind of like get some mastery over this solution and you do this in a whiteboarding coding exercise, man, I promise you will get the job. You will get the job. This is a fantastic use of reduce, and you could really blow your interviewer away by doing something like this, okay? So we're going to figure out a general approach here to start. We know that we want a function that takes a string and returns a Boolean of some kind. And this Boolean basically says like, is this expression balanced or not? Okay, that's what we're trying to get at here. So we're going to make a function called balanced parens, and it's going to take in a string. And then we might call balanced parens with something like, like that. So clearly unbalanced parentheses here. We got 4 opening parens in a row, no closing, it's not balanced. So I'd expect to return false from this, okay? So the first thing to keep in mind is that we are receiving a string here, and all these helpers that we're talking about are array helpers. So they only work on arrays of data. Okay, so the first thing we have to do is turn this string into an array. So we will return string.split, and we'll just split on an empty character. And so now you can see, step 1, we're doing okay. We've turned our string into an array of single characters. So I've got a bunch of individual parentheses. So now the next thing we're going to do is bring in our reduce helper. So I'm just going to chain directly onto it, onto the array that we just created. So we'll pass in our function. We'll go with previous and char. And so char in this case represents a single character. Okay, so this would be like single parenthesis, single parenthesis, single parenthesis. That's what this char variable here is, short for character. So now we need to consider how are we actually going to solve this? What are we going to do here? How are we going to decide what our initial value is? So what I'm going to suggest is I'm going to say we are going to create a counter. Okay, so a counter, which will be an integer number. Every time we see an opening parenthesis, we will increment this counter by 1. every time we see a closing parenthesis, we will decrease it by 1. Then at the very end, after our entire reduce runs, if we have a counter greater than 1, that means that our parentheses must be unbalanced. So we can kind of test this logic out here, right? If I have an expression like this, so this I would expect this to return true, I would increment by 1, subtract 1, add 1, subtract 1, and boom, I got 0. If I did something like this, I would add by 1, add by 1, subtract 1, and I end up with -1, which means they're unbalanced. And then we'll do one more case here of something like this. And so I would add 1, subtract 1, and I've now got 1 as a remainder, which means they're unbalanced. So that's kind of the algorithm or the approach that we're going to take here. So the logic inside of the reduce statement itself won't be that bad. We just need to look at the individual character. If it is an opening parenthesis, we'll increment our counter right here, previous, by 1. If it's a closing paren, we'll subtract 1 instead. So let's put in some logic here. So if char is an opening paren, return ++ previous. If char is a closing paren, return - previous. Otherwise, and this is the case that we always need to be aware of, if we do not have a character in here, a paren, so let's say that someone sticks in some characters like that, then we need to make sure that we still return our counter anyways. So outside of both the if statements, I'll put return previous, like so. Okay, so we can see right now from our output up here, I've got 4. Let's take out this ugly string right here. So I've got 4, which is not 0. So remember, the idea here is that if we run the reduce loop and we get 0 back, that means that they are balanced. So in this case, 4 means nope, not balanced. It's not 0. So clearly, not working here. We do want to make sure that we return an actual Boolean value here. And so we're going to use a little bit of a trick. In front of the entire statement, I'm just going to put an exclamation mark, and that's going to do a flip of Boolean. And the way that JavaScript works, it interprets a positive or negative number as being truthy, and so that'll get flipped to false, as we see here. And it interprets 0 as being falsy, so it gets flipped to true. So if I balance it out, it gets flipped over to true. And if I unbalance it, it goes back to false. And then we can play around with it and watch it go back over to true. Okay, so this is a fantastic use case of reduce. There's just one little thing that we're not catching correctly, and that is the case in which we have balanced parentheses, but they're in a weird order like this. So you see we've got an opening one and a closed one, but that's still showing us true. So we're going to add one more little case in here. If we think about how this would get counted up, the opening parenthesis would decrease my counter to -1 and then back up to 0. So basically, any time that our counter goes into the negatives, that means that, boom, we definitely know that something is going wrong and we have unbalanced parentheses. So we can add in one more catch in here and say if previous is less than 0, just return previous. Don't do anything to it, just return it. And so now we're correctly catching the case where we have the correct number of parentheses, but they're in an incorrect order. So now if I change these back to the correct order, it goes back to true. We can add in some more and then unbalance it by 1 and it goes over to false. Okay. Cool. So like I said, maybe not the most practical or something you're going to be doing on a day-to-day basis, but again, I guarantee you that if you get asked this question in an interview and you bust this out on the whiteboard, oh man, if they don't give you a job offer there on the spot, just drop me an email. I will talk to your interviewer and I will tell them, no, you really got to hire this person because they did a great job. So this would be a fantastic use of the reduce helper right here. All right, so with a little bit more complex example of reduce, let's continue in the next section and get some experience with it in some exercises.